Dámy a pánové, dobrý den. I welcome you to the Severo Institute. We have a special speaker today, and we will start on time because he came to Prague from Singapore. He has to go to Brno tonight. He will return to Prague on Thursday evening, and he will stay here for a few more days, few more meetings and lectures. He will have his lecture in English, but he's a fluent Czech speaker, not fluent Czech lecturer, since he was born half Czech, half German, but now he's been living in Singapore for already some years and many more years before in Korea, so he has left Europe for East Asia. But it's my honor and privilege to welcome Michal Raska here to the Severo Institute and to Czech Republic, because I think that there is only a few experts on issues of the cybersecurity and military innovation of the East Asian region, Southeast Asian region, of the Chinese steppes, working at such prestigious institute as is the RSIS of Singapore. And we are glad that someone speaking Czech is there, someone with attachment to the Czech Republic is there, so we can use his expertise, experience and knowledge. Michal will have a 40-minute presentation, and of course there is going to be time for questions and answers, so don't be shy and prepare your questions and answers. We will have to leave to the train station, so we will have to really end at 7 and go that he doesn't miss his train, since he will be also in Brno at the National Defense University and National Cybersecurity Center, as well as Masaryk University, as part of this tour. So without further ado, I do invite Michal to the podium. Of course, I do not thank you that you have come only. I also do thank all the sponsors, all those who made it possible that we can be arranging such lectures and seminars here in Prague and somehow broadening the horizons of the Czech and not only Czech public and Czech experts. Michael, Michali, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, Tom mentioned that I have to leave early, and the real reason we planned for that was in case, that somebody from the Chinese embassy is going to be chasing me, so I have an escape plan. But anyway, I wanted to really thank you for coming here today. It's a sort of a very hot issue right now, China. Everywhere I go, everybody wants to know what's going on in East Asia, and it's a really great pleasure and privilege for me to be here at Severo. So for me, it's sort of like a homecoming here. I grew up here in Czech, and I left about 20 years ago. And it's a very, it's a sort of, I always have, soft spot in my heart for the Czechs. And everywhere I go, basically, I take the Czech sense of humor with me and try to sort of plant the Czech flag wherever I go. But nevertheless, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I thank Tom for inviting me. I think, Severo is a very interesting institute. They bring together a lot of people from around the world, and it's a great place to network and to discuss interesting issues. So Tom also, besides being a great host, he also likes to pose very difficult questions. And the key question today, the question is China threat to the world order or guarantor of stability? It's a very complex, deep question that at the beginning, it requires some sort of a step back and reflection. What do we mean by world order? What do we mean by threat? What do we mean by guarantor of stability? But in a case, just to start off, just think about the world order. Do we mean world order as a system of sort of the Western-style system of liberal institutionalism, democracy, based on norms, rules, international law? Or do we mean a world order from the Chinese perspective, a world order that has been, that China has seen the world for the past 2,000 years, sort of what they call the all under heaven, where China was at the apex of a hierarchy of states, and the states had a relationship with China based on their distance and how close they were to China. So Chinese world order, Western world order, what do we mean by that? It's also a complex issue because do we even have a world order as we speak? Can we speak, if you look at the world today, all the different security flashpoints and challenges, do we have a world order? All the different issues and trends that are happening in Middle East, in East Asia, in Africa, South America, everywhere you see sort of a convergence of security challenges. And in many ways, you can think about a world in disorder. So here's the questions before even starting thinking about it, threat to world order, what do we mean by that? And so that leads sort of to my next point. And the next point is basically the contrasting narratives. When we think about China, when we think about East Asia, it's always the good story, the positive story. China's rise is Asia's rise. All, rising water lifts all vessels. It's a positive story that China has been trying to also promote, and it has been sort of on the map for many governments and many presentations out there. The idea that as China rises, it brings prosperity to the entire region, and the entire region brings prosperity to the world. So you have that good story, basically, based on strategic stability, economic cooperation, interdependencies. But at the same time, what is very interesting is in this narrative is you have a story of China's assertiveness. The idea that China is not only rising economically, but also its political and strategic interests are also changing, and is trying to leverage its military power to secure its political and military interest, particularly in East Asia. So when we think about Asia's rise, it's always this contrasting paradox. Even President Park Geun-hye in South Korea also calls it basically the paradox. But what is really interesting if you step back is that never in a history you had a country such as China that has shown so much economic promise and at the same time strategic uncertainty. And the question of narratives is very important. If I go tomorrow and give this lecture in Japan, the question, whether China is a threat to world order, guarantor stability, will also have a different perceptions. So what is very interesting, what is very important to understand is there are contrasting narratives. The East Asian narrative, the European narrative, the American narrative, they are all very much mixed, right? And it's very, so that is sort of the starting point. There is no one rising China. There's no one narrative out there. But anytime power rises, it always sort of brings together a lot of questions and uncertainties. Nevertheless, what I want to do today is to basically show have reflections on 4 issues. On one, how do we conceptualize rise of China in a broader Asian security perspective? How do we think about Asian security and its evolution over the past 100 years? And then I will focus more on trying to figure out what we think China wants. As we all know, we all have our own biases and our own sort of looking glass, how we look at China, just like the Chinese have their own looking glass, how they see us or Europeans So I will try to decode a little bit what we think China wants. It's again mostly is based on my research on China and my experience and interactions being in the region. Then, if you have time, I'll try to explain a little bit about Chinese power projection and focusing on military. My work is on military, so I do a lot of work on military transformation, military modernization. So I will try to show or try to reflect a little bit on China's evolving military strategy and how they use military power to secure their interests in the region. And then at the end of the day, I will try to bring it back. What does it mean for future strategic interactions in the region in East Asia? And perhaps, we can have a discussion, what does it mean for Europe? So let me start with the very colorful diagram. This is based on my mentor's book, Professor Chang-Min Lee in South Korea. He has a great book called Asia's Fault Lines that is coming out at Carnegie in January. And he basically conceptualizes East Asia's sort of regional geostrategic transformation into four blocks. So think about the red block from 1850s to 1950s. East Asia was literally in chaos. East Asia at the time was responding to the rise or to the encroachment of Western powers. So you had a first, second Opium War, you have a Russo-Japanese War, you have a Japanese invasion of Korea and China, you have a first and second World War that were also being happening in East Asia. But the point was that 100 years ago, East Asia was in chaos. And the reason was, again, because it was trying to respond to the West. The only country that really responded to the Western encroachment was Japan. Japan was the only country at the time that acquired, tried to emulate Western knowledge, tried to emulate and acquire Western technologies, and was able to basically adopt a little bit to the Western model. Then we move a little bit to the Bloc B, to the Cold War, and from 1950s to 1970s, when East Asia was at the center point also between two superpowers, Soviet Union and the United States. So again, we had a limited type of conflicts. We had the Vietnam War, the Korean War. They were also reflected in the larger context of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, we moved into an era what we call a U.S. strategic primacy. The U.S. after the Cold War was the predominant hegemon in the region. It had a preponderance of power. It had unlimited. It had the most influence, and it was basically unchallenged. And that was basically from the late 1980s to 1990s. And over the last decade or so, we are shifting into a new sort of paradigm. And that is, again, here's the question. It is the rise of China. It is the rise of Asia. And the narrative is basically positive. The economic interdependencies will bring positive economic development for the entire region and cooperation and peace and stability. But as Asia rises, as China rises, it also brings a lot of uncertainties. So the paradigm has shifted. Now, East Asia, Europe, or US, or the dominant sort of powers, is trying to figure out how do we respond to China's rise. So you see the paradigm has shifted, right? So 100 years ago, Asia was trying to respond to Western rise, Western encroachment. Now we are trying to figure out how do we respond to China's rise. And that is a principal question and principal dilemma that has been on the table for many, many countries out there. How do we conceptualize China's rise? How do we integrate China into existing world order? Or how do we make sure that the economic interdependencies and mutual trust prevail over distrust and uncertainty? So if you if you go a little bit step deeper, and if you look at the underlying strategic trends, it's always, the pluses and the negatives, right? So on one hand, you have economic cooperation, you have multilateral policy initiatives, you have increasing emphasis of good governance, more transparency, so again, it's the good story. But at the same time, you have, the underlying, great power rivalries between China, US, China, Japan, China, India, maybe Russia and China in the long run, and others. So all these major countries or major powers are trying to compete for influence and power. You have weakening deterrence and strategic distrust. So countries like North Korea have nuclear ambitions and try to improve their weapons of mass destruction capabilities. You have also the socio-economic problems. As Asia rises, so does its socio-economic problems. So you have rising inequalities, socio-economic gaps, rising nationalism, a lot of non-state actors, terrorism. So in every possible security issue out there, Asia has that. So as my professor says, Asia is a supermarket of security threats. And if you take that again, those are the some of the underlying trends. And what is really interesting in this picture is how past, present, and future intertwine. The reason Asia is where it is because it has unresolved historical legacies. As much as Europe has sort of solidified its transformation from the Second World War, East Asia hasn't really resolved the historical legacy of the Japanese colonial period, of Second World War, and others. So today's security challenges in East Asia are basically the mixture of unresolved historical legacies and as well as emerging security threats. And emerging security threats, that includes everything from cyber, energy security, territorial rivalries, the struggle for dominance, everything from conventional to nonlinear security threats. So it's the past, present, and future that is basically intertwined. And what that creates, what the consequences of that is that if you have multiple cascading crises happening in the region, and the region is unable to respond to that. Because unlike in Europe, which has developed institutions and sort of multilateral frameworks to deal with complex security dilemmas, East Asia still has a long way to go in terms of how to manage crises. And that is a fundamental issue. So if you look at the map, so traditionally you had hotspots like Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, South China Sea, and others. And usually these flashpoints have been analyzed very, very exclusively on their own. So Korean Peninsula was a security environment, security theater on its own. Taiwan, China was on its own. But what is happening now, all these different security flashpoints are converging. So whatever happens in East Asia, in Korean Peninsula, will have an impact in South China Sea and Southeast Asia. And with the same token of understanding is also something that I want to bring to the Europeans here. So whatever happens in East Asia or Southeast Asia will have a direct implications on Europe. And this is something that in prevailing security challenges the Europeans focus on, this is something that is not being really understood. So convergent security, unresolved historical legacies, new threats, complex security dilemmas, it's all out there. And if you take all the different issues, again, that I just mentioned, from conventional to nonlinear security, China has a major footprint. So whether we talk about the US-China strategic competition, Sino-Japanese tensions in East China Sea, North Korean implosion, future of Taiwan, Chinese moves in South China Sea, regional energy competition, cybersecurity, whatever you name, in every security issue, China has a major footprint. So I cannot work on Asian security without looking at China. So how Asia evolves very much depends on how China evolves. So Chinese trajectory will shape regional trajectory, and regional trajectory will impact European and global trajectory. And that's why this issue is so important. So let's think about what does China want? What we think does China want? It is very important to understand our own biases. If I don't know how many of you have been to China. China has multiple identities, multiple regions. There's no one China as it maybe on paper, but there are so many. The region is so diverse, and there are just so many different, so many internal differences. So it is very important to say what we think, what China wants, and how do we analyze China. So on one hand, you have the sinologists. They are Mandarin speakers. They translate everything that is out there. So they have to have access to internal Chinese authoritative primary source data. You have to understand also the professional military terminology in Chinese. And there's sort of the community of analysts out there. They focus specifically on that. It has two challenges. One is getting access to primary authoritative data. And once you get the access, you also have to understand the terminology, which is not simple. So the sinologists focus on that. Then you have strategic studies guys, IR specialists, who look at, again, the strategic side of things, and they try to integrate what the sinologists do into a much broader perspective. And there's always debate between these two camps. But whenever we analyze China and Chinese policy strategy, we have to basically distinguish the sources of data. Where does it come from? Who writes it? How important is it? So we can distinguish between authoritative sources, which is the government, PLA, which is the military, if there are any publicly available sources. And these are generally very broad. Then we have the quasi-authoritative sources, which are sort of government-linked think tanks, universities. They are a little bit more focused in terms of their writing. And then you have the non-authoritative sources, blogs, Chinese netizens, and all out there. So it is very difficult to focus on China without understanding the different sources and methodologies of China. And that is very, very, very important. Otherwise, you become the victim of your own biases, if you will. So today, I just took two documents the Chinese government announced this year, they announced a new security strategic guidelines and new doctrine. So I'll present a little bit, couple of very interesting points in terms of what they announced that China wants and how we interpret that. So in 2015, the new security strategic guidelines basically mentioned that China faces unpredictable and unprecedented dangers facing China both home and abroad. And what is really interesting for the Chinese, the major threat you might think is outside, but it's not. The major threat for the Chinese is internal. And there are three key strategic priorities. Preservation of the political supremacy of the Communist Party of China. That is number one priority for the Chinese. Number two is maintaining China's internal territorial integrity and internal stability. That means no provinces should be break off. There should be no uprising. One thing that the Chinese are really, really afraid of are the colored revolutions, right? So really making sure that China stays as a one is number two priority. And of course, to do number one and number two, you need balanced, sustainable economic development. So safeguarding China's national sovereignty, national security, and territorial integrity, and supporting China's peaceful development are basically the core internal strategic priorities China has. And this is very important because really if you look at China today, the magnitude of internal challenges are breathtaking. So as China rises, you will have a lot of crises. Just a couple of months ago, you had the major explosion in Tianjin, right? The major port exploded. The magnitude of every crisis that happens in China is exponential. And the government doesn't have the ability to respond to all the crises in timely and effective manner. And as Chinese netizens sort of get online, they're also putting more accountability on the government to respond to their growing needs and interest. But again, the key issue for China is internal stability. That's the number one. If you look at how China looks outside. So, of course, the story is positive. The Chinese want to promote common prosperity of all countries. They emphasize great power relations. They want to, emphasize cooperation among developing countries, proactively participate in regional global governance. And there's a little asterisk there, while promoting or seeking to ensure its own national interest. So as China rises, so its national interests are expanding. And here's the question, again, what does that mean in the long term? What does it mean a world without hegemonism and power politics? What does it mean under the concept of harmonious Asia that they promote? And here again, we can go back to the initial sort of thought, how China envisioned the world and what the debates are in a way. One camp, you have those, what I call China doves, and they understand China basically through that positive lens that economic independencies, the prosperity that China brings is nothing but good. And then you have China hawks, and I'm a little bit a China hawk, a little bit myself because of my own internal bias and my mentors. And you have to ask yourself, well, does really China want a multipolar world? Is it really the end state what they want? Or is it sort of return back to the world order that they used to have? That means, again, the hierarchical, all under heaven type of order, where China was at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of states under God, under the sun, and all the other relationships with their neighbors was based on the distance to the Chinese empire. So what China wants when we talk about harmonious Asia, in my view, is deference. Deference is the key word. It's submission. And that is a sort of my own, bias in a way, again, how we interpret this. But when we look at this, when we look at the actual implementation of the strategy and what the Chinese do, we can come up with some elements, with some of the pointers. Of course, China promotes its own vision of one belt, one road. I don't know how many of you heard that. It's a concept, it's a main geostrategic idea of the Chinese that they promote everywhere. It's the idea of connecting Asia with Europe on the belt, which is the northern route, and there's the northern corridor sector, there is the central and southern. So you have that northern sort of land belt. And then you have the maritime Silk Road, which is supposed to connect, again, Asia with China through the maritime domain. And the idea is to create market access. By promoting market access, it shows, again, that China has a problem, which is a surplus. They sit on a $4 trillion of savings, and they need to invest it somewhere. So one way to do that and create a market outside is to create these grandiose, ambitious visions of positive sort of Silk Road connecting Europe and Asia together. But you have to ask yourself, once they do that, or if you map out the investments, they basically follow this concept. And I read stories that the Chinese also invested in Czech Republic a little bit, and that should be sort of conceptualized in this major framework, right? But you have to ask yourself, what does it mean in the long term? Well, and again, if you read the Chinese literature and you come up with, openly, open description. What they want is to create a periphery or zone of strategic dependence. Right? By connecting Asia and Europe, by opening up the market access, by investing in here, that in the long run creates a zone or periphery of strategic dependencies. So that investment that China does in Europe will lead in the long term to sort of political concessions and understanding sort of the political interest that China has. That's one potential sort of priority. What else do they want? They want energy access. In order for China to grow, it needs to have energy. It needs to have access and secure lines of sea lines of communications that will connect them to the energy sources around the world. So they are building the maritime Silk Road along, and investing in ports that will enable them to extract resources, not only from Africa, but also energy resources from the Middle East. And that is very interesting. I live in Singapore, and currently, which is, on that corner right here, and 80% of China's oil flows through the Straits of Malacca. Right? So it's a very, very geostrategic domain. So energy access is a key for fueling China's economy down the road. Now, of course, with energy access and protecting sea lines of communications, you also have to have what they call the rightful strategic presence. So if you think about the conflict in South China Sea, where China basically claims the entire South China Sea, is part of that greater basically strategy of securing the sea lines of communications all the way to the Middle East and Africa, and making sure that Chinese ships can flow through that. Of course, South China Sea in itself is a major energy supply depot. So, but it's not only about the energy. So it's again, I mentioned at the beginning, China needs to basically be one in a way, the territorial integrity, and whatever happens internally has a sort of external consequences. So South China Sea sort of is a reflection of Chinese ambition to look strong on the outside, to unite all the different Chinese netizens, the Chinese population, through nationalism and to preserve sort of the identity by looking up, by projecting power in the South China Seas. And that's why, of course, they've been claiming the islands. They've been basically doing a lot of land reclamation. Now there's a lot of talk that some of these islands will be militarized, and again, the potential consequences of that are not yet to be seen. But it's also important, it's not only China that has territorial claims in there. It's also Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia. But I think in terms of magnitude of land reclamation, the Chinese have been most active. But the South China Sea is a sort of reflection, again, of the broader strategic interest that China has in the long run. What else do the Chinese want? Access to foreign high technology. And that is also very much. In order for China to rise, it needs to have access to high technologies. And usually the debate was the Chinese basically copy and emulate everything. Well, it's not longer that. It's not only that the Chinese will reverse engineer these technologies. Now the process has changed to the next level. Basically, they have something called IDAR model, which is their own version of what they call indigenous innovation. And the idea is to identify, digest, absorb, and reinvent key foreign technologies from everywhere. So basically what that means is they no longer copy, but they try to understand what they copy, and they're trying to understand and trying to implement their own innovation within these technologies. So if you think about the major military platforms, the design may look, it's a copy, but internally it's all Chinese technology and Chinese systems. So it changes the way in which the components are linked together, and while leaving core concepts design intact. But what is very interesting, think about this issue is, the difference in narratives. In the US, cyber espionage, China cyber threat is very much on a hot topic. And I'm asking myself, why is it not really, debated in Europe, right? Are Europeans thinking, oh, Chinese are basically not hacking us, or they are not really interested in our technologies? But it's very interesting how the narrative and debates vary. So for the US, cyber issue is top priority. I have yet to see sort of the awareness on the European side that, protecting, intellectual property and technologies. So again, many of these, you can argue that Europeans are always interested also in economic cooperation, economic development, and prosperity and all that. But again, in the long run, what happens with a lot of these investment is as long as China has access to these technologies, as long as they can absorb these technologies, they will continue to invest. Once they acquire these technologies, they'll let these companies fail. So again, this is one of the academic models, again, how China is moving from duplicative imitation, from emulation, to more what we call architectural innovation. They are trying very hard to focus on radical innovation, the modular innovation, how to cross the next stage in the ladder, if you will. But they still face a lot of structural problems and a lot of issues, and which precludes them to reach sort of the radical modular or radical innovation. So that's why they focus on the IDAR model as a way to catch up with the West as fast as possible. So catching up with the West, identifying key technologies, absorbing, digesting the knowledge behind them, and reinventing them. That's the essence of China's indigenous innovation. And many of the companies, by the way, compete with each other for technological blueprints, for others. So it's a sort of internal competition there as well. So let's look also at Chinese evolving military strategy. There's been a lot of talk in East Asia about what the Chinese can do, how we measure their progress, are they a real threat or what not. Again, traditionally, historically, China has projected power through economic influence. That was sort of their own version of how they reached different nations. But now, in addition to the economic influence, they are rapidly modernizing their military. And over the past decade, China has made a great leap, it has made great progress in modernizing their military, and they are still doing so. Now, one explanation why they have been able to do that is simple: money. They have been pouring a lot of money into the military. So if you look at the defense spending on nominal terms from 1994 to over the last 2 decades, you see the exponential rise, the fastest growth by China. China overspends Japan, India, and South Korea, and all the Southeast Asian countries in terms of military spending. In 2014, it spent about $176 billion. Now, you can always ask, well, compared to the U.S., which spends about 700, 800 billion, this is still a quarter, what the U.S. spends. And of course, you can also say in terms of percentage of GDP is also very limited. Many Chinese say basically we always, we put only, 1.5% of our GDP into defense expenditures. But nevertheless, one of the explanations why Chinese military has been qualitatively improving was they just simply poured money into it, and they continue to do so. So again, here are some facts. Defense budget has grown at average rate 14% a year. Military spending has doubled in real terms and trebled in nominal terms since 2005. And what is very interesting, by 2020, defense expenditures by China will probably reach around $260 billion. And over that, what is also interesting, they put 20% of that into procurement and research and development. So the research and development budget in the Chinese military is also very significant because it enables them to come up with new technologies and modernize their military. Now, in terms of military strategy, of course, again, how do we assess China's military strategy is a very complicated process. But they have what they call something called military strategic guidelines. And those are basically general principles and terms that guide the operational level and tactical level of the PLA. And they have been changed about 8 or 9 times over the past, since 1949. And the way they are being changed are very gradual. So basically they identify, strategic opponent, and they basically understand the changes or perceived threats to China's national interest. They look at, something what they call basic preparations for military struggle, when they look at how the PLA will fight future wars. And if they see a change in character of warfare, they will make a change in the military strategic guidelines. So to give you that example how that basically process worked, in 1993, after the Gulf War, the military strategy was under the concept of winning local wars under modern high-tech conditions. So as soon as war break out, it is likely to be high-technology confrontation. Basically, the Chinese were studying what happened in the first Persian Gulf War. In 2004, again, about a decade later, the concept has changed into something called winning local wars under condition of informatization. And again, there was a sort of integration of high technology and into the military, sort of Chinese version of network-centric warfare, which they emulated. And now in 2015, they changed the guidelines again, what they call winning informationized local wars. So they expect future conflicts to be informationized, which means very much high-tech, and local. So whether it's the East China Sea or South China Sea, primarily, in those areas, or vis-a-vis Taiwan. So based on that, they have tried to adjust the military modernization trajectory on these concepts. And again, if you look at, the power projection capabilities, the primarily focus was on the maritime domain. So traditionally, Chinese defense strategy was internal, protecting sort of its land-based borders against Soviet Union, against Russia, and other possible internal threats. But now the military strategy is changing to the maritime domain. And here they have a concept of the first and second island chain. And those are the first island chain. You have the Japan, all the way Japan to Borneo down. That's sort of the first island chain, which they're trying to project power into these waters. In the long term, about 10, 15 years from now, they are trying to project power, what they call, into second island chain. And second island chain goes again from Japan all the way to Guam. So this is sort of the long-term, strategic sort of focus. And here again, the primary idea is to deny, the U.S. power in the region, and to enable Chinese PLA its freedom of action. So, in other words, what it means is to deny the freedom of action of American projected forces and its allies there, while enabling the freedom of action of Chinese forces. And one day they do that. They basically have a concept what they call counter-intervention. And that's the American version of what they call anti-access area denial. Those are, again, military terms. But the idea, again, is to force the U.S. out, to increase the cost of possible intervention, and to enable, to delay U.S. military from potential crises. And if you read again the Chinese literature, again you see that shift from these core missions, from territorial coastal defense, into something what they call diversified mission. And diversified missions again means in power projection in different domains. It starts with the first and second island chain that I just mentioned, and in the long term, 20, 30 years from now, they are trying to look at power projections along the sea lines of communications. So protecting the sea lines of communications all the way that I mentioned at the map earlier, protecting the maritime Silk Road, protecting the Chinese interests abroad, this is what this PLA is basically trying to focus on. In the long run, they also talk about space and controlling basically outer space. And in this context, the Chinese basically envision 4 domains of military rivalry. Those are 4 domains where they envision the future conflicts will involve. One will be space, near space, cyberspace, and underwater. And these 4 domains is where the PLA again focuses its capabilities, its modernization, and these are basically asymmetric type of domains where they feel they have the advantage over the potential adversary. So think about it, space and cyberspace. Space means satellites, satellite communication. Every state out there depends on satellites. Your financial infrastructure, transportations, logistics, communications are all linked through satellites. Once you disable or disrupt or manipulate the satellites, the country loses access to all these critical infrastructures that I mentioned. One way to do it, again, is through cyber. So space and cyberspace are virtually connected. Near space is more about the hypersonic vehicles and more the conventional ballistic missiles. They have the potential to target the carriers in the Western Pacific. And of course, underwater systems by high-tech precision mines. Those are mines that are deeply embedded in the seabed. And if you have a sub or carrier that out there, the mine is able to basically locate the sub and launch itself automatically to that. The Americans have a major headache on Chinese underwater mine warfare capabilities. So what does it all mean? In essence, China wants to win a war without fighting. It doesn't seek confrontation. It doesn't want to go into war with the US, right? But it wants to have enough power to win a war without fighting. And that's the key, right? If I instill in my opponent or adversary, that he or she cannot win a fight with me, then the war is basically won at the outset. It's very similar to what the Russians are doing here. Nobody will go into war with Russia over Ukraine, right? Precisely because of that, the Russians understand that. And so they condition the mind of adversary before the fight is even begun. And so the Chinese are trying to do the same. They try to condition the potential adversaries that it doesn't make any sense to go to war with China, because the cost of going to war with China will be exponential. And at the same time, China doesn't want to escalate things either. China understands that it needs regional stability for its economic prosperity. So the Chinese are basically not seeking a major escalation. But what they are trying to do, again, is increase the influence in these 4 domains of military rivalries and project power in such way they're able to basically get away with that, just like the Russians in Ukraine or the Crimea. So if China takes islands in South China Sea, just like the Russians take a little bit of the eastern Ukraine, nobody will go with China, war with China. And that's a sort of one strategy that they have. And it goes back to the ancient sort of strategic wisdom. Usually the Chinese never go back to Sun Tzu, they don't mention Sun Tzu, but it's about military strategy based on intent. I will attack my adversary through subjugation and deception. Again, I will condition my adversary's mind into limiting his strategic choices in such a way that he will realize before the fight is even started that he has no choice but a defeat, right? And that strategy basically contrasts with Western-style strategy, where you attack your military forces one-on-one, the sort of the Clausewitzian, approach, where military is sort of these major clashes. So what I'm trying to say is the character and the form of future conflicts will change, and China is already focusing on that. So what does that mean for the future? Now, for one thing, you have to look at what does it mean for the U.S. strategy in the region. All the traditional forward bases in the U.S. strategy will become increasingly vulnerable. And there will be rising potential costs for any type of conflict, of intervention. So what does that mean for the U.S. is devising a new strategy vis-à-vis China. How much conventional precision strike capabilities should we have? How much defensive choices should we have? Should we base our strategy of limiting, Chinese, offshore a little bit further away? Should we engage China, closer to the region? Again, how do we basically check Chinese, military power without escalation? That's a sort of the U.S. and while preserving our, our primary strategic presence in the region. So all the U.S. rebalancing policy in East Asia that has been going on is sort of comprehensive economic, diplomatic, political, and military way of how to respond to China. But it is a challenge. How do we manage China's rise? And that also is a challenge for all other states in the region. How do we maintain our security relationship with the United States and at the same time deepen our relationship with the Chinese economically? So if you think countries like Singapore, Korea, South Korea now trains more with China than it does with the US. Japan and China is a little bit more complicated, but there are perennial strategic uncertainties going forward. Again, it's what I mentioned at the beginning, is the confluence of strategic distrust and unresolved historical legacies with sort of emerging threats. What does that mean for small states? Alliances and strategic partnerships, the value of that will increase. So, as you know, as you have traditional alliances with Korea, China, with Korea, Japan, these bilateral alliances will evolve further, and the value of these alliances will be increasingly more important. Because precisely all the countries in the region, they understand they cannot match Chinese military or economic power unilaterally. So what they are trying to do is adjust the relationship with a great power such as the US, and at the same time they are trying to modernize their own militaries. So what we have in East Asia is sort of an arms competition. Arms competition that will continue to evolve further. What does it mean for Europe? Again, you have to understand Chinese national grand strategy going forward, its interest, and the fact that looking at Europe, that China looks at Europe much broader and much deeper in the long term. So a lot of these investments that I mentioned, are part of a greater strategy that will enable China access and political influence down the road. Europe also has to strengthen its cybersecurity, its cyber against potential cyber espionage, and it has to understand the risk and costs of transferring technologies to China. And so, going back to the question, is China a threat or guarantor stability? But it's a little bit of both. And I will be very academic in that. On one hand, it brings economic interdependencies, and at the same time, it brings strategic competition. So what we have at the end of the day is something what we can call competitive coexistence. Competitive coexistence based on complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity inherent in Asian geopolitics. So I will leave it at that. And I look forward for your questions.
So, thank you very much. There is a microphone. I have some questions. I don't see the hands yet. So, if you can go back to the slide number 8, I will go.
I need a drink first.
You drink. I will go to slide number 8. And this one. So if you would have a crystal ball, or what is the more worrying from those 3 crisis areas or tension
That's
areas?
An excellent question.
The Sea of Japan, the East China Sea meaning Taiwan, or the South China Sea meaning Vietnam and whatever the competition. Where the explosion would be the first?
I get this question asked a lot of times. It's a very interesting, again, it's a very complicated question. On one hand, conventional wisdom would say that the primary strategic instability of potential for future conflict is between China and Japan in East China Sea, because both powers have the military capabilities to engage each other in long distances over these islands. If you look at the South China's militaries or South China Sea, a lot of these countries in South China, in Southeast Asia, don't have the military capabilities to engage China as much as Japan does and China. But the counter-argument to that is, if China and Japan both have these military power projection capabilities, it creates a sort of area of deterrence. So both will not try to escalate and go into conflict. And that's why South China Sea and the territorial disputes in South China Sea increase the risk of potential conflict there. But regardless, whatever happens in one area will have inherent effect and impact on the other. And the problem is, if you have a little spark, if you have a little crisis, that can easily escalate into something bigger, right? So escalation control is very, very complicated in the region, and potential for misunderstanding and risk for misunderstanding is very high. I don't know if you saw the news just last week. The U.S. started to, do its ship patrols near some of the islands claimed by China. It's a sort of shift in U.S. strategy. The U.S. was traditionally very much neutral in these conflicts, but now is increasingly pulled into taking sides. Right? And that creates, if you have militaries on both sides in close proximity together, that again creates a risk of potential miscalculation. And whatever happens in the region, again, if it's a crisis on a Korean Peninsula, South China Sea, East China Sea, China will have a major say. And that in turn will also have consequences for Europe. Because if these trade routes are disrupted, right, if the trade is disrupted, again, it has an impact for European economies and European future as well.
Let me ask. Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, my name is Elisa Kizekova, and I work at the Chamber of Deputies, but my academic affiliation is in Australia, Bond University, and I also worked in RSIS for a while. But
really?
I don't think we ever met. So I have two questions, and they might be quite specific and quite detailed, because I actually very much appreciated your presentation. By far one of the best I've heard in Prague since I moved here 2 years ago. What I like, I guess, is your take on the strategic coexistence. And I'll bounce off your conclusion about how the others are going to respond. Mm-hmm. And that's from the keynote that I got from Shangri-La Dialogue, where the Prime Minister from Singapore, Lee, actually articulated that it's the bilateral relationship between China and US that is the key sort of guarantor or disruptor of the region. So I would like to shift the argument actually to that bilateral relationship rather than single out China as its own. And here I want to say one thing. What's your take on the competitive nature in terms of sort of different projects that they present? We've got the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and the US was known as having reservations and discouraging others to join. And then we have the TPP partnership, where it's known that there might be some obstacles for China to join in the future. So Singaporean take from the Prime Minister was that he would hope that they both joined the other competitive environments and they will collaborate. But as we know, that's not necessarily likely. So what do you think is the Singaporean role in this? Is it going to mediate? Because we all know they don't want to take sides. And the second question is quite specific. We read here, obviously, news from the US with regards to the innovations and the US tech firms collaborating with Chinese companies who get guidance from former Chinese admirals. And therefore, there is a question now whether this is in danger of the US national security. However, when you investigate, you find out the American firms are not violating the laws. It's an open market, and it's a competitive market, and it shouldn't be closed to certain deals. However, there is a saying that they are advantaging a military rival, in their view, China. So how does one approach this situation if you don't break the law, the companies want to collaborate, and yet they feel that the strategic components are being handed out to competitor?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I think this will be a topic for another presentation, but let me try to address those. On the competitive coexistence, of course, that's something that I mentioned, that I didn't emphasize in my presentation, the relationship between US and China as being the key relationship in shaping the regional and maybe even global world order, if you will, right? But I see it more, again, it's on the competitive side, and on this presentation today, I focus specifically more on the Chinese priorities and interests, and you could make the same presentation on the US side. So today I just focus a little bit on China. But just to reiterate how the Asian countries are responding, and basically the idea from them is the idea that we don't have to choose. We don't have to choose between China and the US. We can do business with the Chinese, and we can enhance or maintain our security partnership with the US. So the problem that I have with that is, like, this is a sort of a Singaporean take, or many of the ASEAN countries, is once you don't have to choose, but what if you are forced to choose? Then, in other words, what happens, what these countries, how they will respond if you do have a minor military clash in South China Sea. And the problem with ASEAN is that, again, the rise of China is dividing ASEAN. On one hand, you have countries like Vietnam and Philippines who are very strongly opposing Chinese encroachment into their territorial waters. And then you have countries like Cambodia and Myanmar, who very much side with China. So the key challenge for ASEAN or these countries is how to preserve the ASEAN centrality. The idea that of non-alignment, the idea that ASEAN was always free from interference of great powers. At least that's the narrative that is being portrayed in the region. The reality is slightly different. Again, because these, precisely as you mentioned, the US-China relationship is dividing the region and is creating sort of currents and areas of competition as well as cooperation. But it's very important to understand neither China or the US want to go into war with each other. All right? It's not in their interest. They need each other. Right? The problem is, again, because they have a different visions on how the world order should be, how the regional order should be, that's where they clash. So that's sort of one, issue. And then you mentioned the TPP, the AIIB, right? This is a reflection of great power politics, right? These are, on one hand, of course, economic sort of initiatives, but at the grand strategic level, again, they are geopolitically, connected. So when you join these banks, or when you join these initiatives, it creates, again, strategic dependencies, right? And strategic dependencies, in return, creates influence over great power over the other countries. Right? So if you are a member of these states or on these initiatives, you are part of a club with certain rules or certain access, with certain benefits and incentives, but also with certain limitations as well. And again, these different initiatives is a reflection of a major geopolitical competition that is going on in the region. But the question of innovation in China is very, very complicated. The Chinese have embargo on important, sensitive technologies. The European defense companies cannot export weapons into China. So what the Chinese are trying to do is bypass it through civil dual-use technologies. I may not have access to the latest radar or the latest software codes, but I will learn how the civilian planes are being made, right? The process and standardization, the idea, how to build these things creates a lot of know-how, a lot of knowledge that is being transferred into China. The problem is, again, of course, there's a lot of, talk about how much the Chinese are actually hacking or how much they are actually, extracting and what benefits they actually get. There's a debate. Just because you have access to the blueprints doesn't mean that you can actually understand and create this, effectively, or build this effectively. So you may have, the latest F-35 blueprints, but you can maybe extract some of the technologies, but that doesn't mean that you can actually understand how to build an exact copy of F-35. But what is really important for European, this region of the world is understand the vulnerabilities. Not only, creating the dependencies, but accepting Chinese investments unconditionally, which again will later have greater political cost, but also on the technology side. Right? Of course, it makes sense economically. Yes, I will create more jobs in the short term. I will, this is great. Chinese investment will come into the country. It looks good. Politicians looks great. There's absolutely, it's all look very positive. But if you look at the Chinese investment in Europe, economically they don't make any sense, right? Economically, they make no sense. So you have to understand the greater political, strategic underlying drivers that shape these investments, right? And the political cost that is or will be somewhere down the road, right? And what the Chinese, in the wisdom are basically able to do is through these dependencies is to divide the alliances, right? They're able to divide alliances in East Asia, and they are trying to divide alliances now in Europe, right? Precisely because of economic incentives, right? But again, that doesn't mean that China wants to dominate the region. They don't have any territorial interest into being in Europe, into taking territory. What they want is simple, as I mentioned, deference, right? It's a sort of a modern version of all under heaven. And that is a concept that the Chinese have for over 2,000 years. So the way they look at the world is very, very different the way we look at the world, right? And that is sort of, what, the community here needs to sort of think about a little bit further and deeper and discuss more.
There is a question.
Hello, my name is Luboš Baran and I will speak my mother languages. Budem rozprávať po slovensky, aby som to správne formuloval. Dnes som čítal článok o tom, ako Američania plánujú...
Môžete trochu nahlas, pretože ja vás neslyším.
Áno. Dnes som čítal článok, ako Američania plánujú hliadky v Juhočínskom mori. Moja otázka v podstate je veľmi jednoduchá. Čo si myslíte o agresívnej americkej politike v danom teritoriu? Vzhľadom na to, že vo svete je niekoľko veľmi problematických vecí, ktoré spôsobili Spojené štáty americké. Jednak poprvé destabilizácia situácie na Blízkom východe. Jednak kríza na východnej Ukrajine, kde pomohli zvrhnúť legitímnu vládu Janukoviča. A jednak po tretie migračná kríza zo Sýrie, Iraku, Afganistanu, ktorej dnes čelí Európska únia. Takže čo si vy myslíte o agresívnej politike Američanov v danom regiu a či vôbec tam majú vstupovať? Ďakujem.
Okay, this is an interesting question. If you look at the U.S. and its changing strategy, priorities, its involvement in the Middle East, in East Asia and global, you have to ask yourself, it's not U.S. being aggressive, but you have to understand what are U.S. principal strategic weaknesses. Just like China has principal strategic weaknesses, so does U.S. The U.S. principal strategic weakness is global responsibility and global presence. They have to be present everywhere. They have to put their resources globally and prioritize the different crises, right? So this is their biggest weakness, that they cannot be everywhere at the same time. And no longer they can shape, the world order as they used to be during the Cold War or post-Cold War. So the hegemony, as I mentioned at the beginning, the predominance of power or the hegemony of the post-Cold War where the U.S. was able to directly shape the world order is gone. Right? Because precisely you have multiple security challenges. They cannot be everywhere and they cannot do everything as they used to be. And that creates a challenge. On one hand is the relationship how the other powers have with the U.S. On one end is a sort of what I call love and hate relationship. Right? On one hand, the narrative is the U.S. should be out. It should be out on places that shouldn't be it in the first place. It should be distance itself in far areas that it shouldn't be there. Once the U.S. start to leave, and what we see in Afghanistan, Iraq, is power vacuums. And these power vacuums create even greater destabilization and potentially breed, radical terrorism and further chaos. So as the U.S. withdraws, power vacuum, imposes, more destabilization. So then we call the U.S. back. and say, hey, we want you to go back. We want you to, stabilize this. Now we have, these gazillions of waves of refugees coming into Europe, right? If the U.S. was there in a way in the region, it will be more stable. So it's this love and hate relationship with the U.S., and the U.S. diplomacy has to work twice as harder, to win allies and win influence. What is very interesting in East Asian perspective, the U.S. has and will have the preponderance of military power for the next 2 decades. The U.S. military is the most sophisticated, most advanced military out there. But diplomatically and politically, the influence don't match the U.S. military capabilities, and which is a paradox. And so if you look at Koreans and Japanese, they also have a love and hate relationship. Right? On one hand, we need the U.S. to preserve our deterrence vis-à-vis the North Koreans. But on the other hand, we want the U.S. out so we can, develop our own foreign and security policy. And these debates are being reflected all around the world, right? Of course, there are other underlying political strategic interests, but it's a part, of the global disorder that we probably have right now. I don't know if it answers your question. I wouldn't say the U.S. is overly aggressive or, vis-a-vis other countries, right? But as every major power pursues its own national interest, the U.S. is not the only one who does that. But it's really how do we manage the great power competition? How do we respond to potential, hotspots? And how do we manage, the relationship between countries? That is. And state and non-state actors as well. That is a principal challenge.
There is a microphone, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you for your lecture, and obviously we don't have much time. I'm a Metropolitan University Prague student on MA, and I'm writing a dissertation about energy security strategy of China regarding Russia cooperation, in particular in oil and gas. And my question was, I have seen a map on your slides, a new energy route, and I would like to know your personal opinion on this cooperation between China and Russia, whether it is it was too optimistic from Russian side, and whether it will result into this diversification which is aimed in official statements of China. Thank you.
It's an excellent dissertation topic that you focus on. It's a very good question. Very interesting subject. Also, I'm trying to look at it and understand the relationship between China and Russia and energy factor. You have to, again, whatever issue you work on, you have to understand the broader strategic interactions between those two countries. And energy security and energy cooperation is a reflection of the broader strategic interests these countries have. But it's not as simple. Russia and China traditionally have a very complicated relationship of distrust. The Russians generally look down on the Chinese, but at the same time they are terrified of them. And they are terrified of them because the Russian Far East doesn't have this sort of the defensible border against the Chinese influence and community that is out there doing all the business. But nevertheless, the Chinese and Russian strategic interests converge on the idea of how to undermine the Western sort of influence in the world. Not only the U.S., but generally West. So they cooperate together. And of course, they have announced all these ambitious projects. It will take time before these pipelines are being built. It will take at least 2-3 decades before something is going to happen. But for the Russians, of course, they also need the money from the Chinese. So because they don't get the money from the Europeans, so they will turn to China. I see it sort of, there's a term for the relationship that they have. It's called, Russian-Chinese relationship could be defined into axis of convenience. And the axis of convenience is basically, again, we, bring together our policies for a while, as long as it basically serves the same purpose as how to undermine, the Western sort of threat to to these two countries, right? So energy security is one of the most principal strategic issue that drives the decision-making in all countries, right? So China needs energy, it needs an access to energy. There's a lot of talk, one thing that I didn't talk about today, Chinese interest into Arctic, right? And the whole, Russian encroachment into Arctic. There's a lot of, interest in that. So this is an issue that is going to be studied and debated, but I think I applaud you for having a very good dissertation topic.
I'd like to thank Ambassador Poyar for inviting you, Dr. Raska, and for your perspicacious presentation. Mm-hmm. In looking, European Anti-Corruption Center, pardon. In looking at the politics of the economics of the choices of technology for long-range strategic defense or any other strategic issue, including resources, and looking beyond the questions of Chinese investment, shall we say, in rare earth elements and agricultural and mining projects in Southeast Asia and in South America, a more prescient concern for people in Europe and America is, for example, beyond the issues of Chinese investments and participation with Polish companies over the last 15 years. But, of course, an example is the very large deal made in 2013 under Yanukovych with a Ukrainian agricultural firm, in fact, the largest agricultural firm in Ukraine, run by a Russian, in the central east of Ukraine. For an area of landmass the size of Belgium, which is 9% of the agricultural land in Ukraine, there are serious questions about the structure of the deal. Some say that, in fact, the land has been sold to the Chinese. Others, under protest by the chairman of that company, say it has only been leased. The conditions of the deal are, needless to say, quite surprising. The land will produce wheat and pigs primarily, and will be sold at far below market prices to the Chinese for the next 50 years, and that is the structure of the deal. But important is to note that a military-owned company in China is in fact behind the deal. And so in looking at a strategic projection map, which can be done in terms of food, how would you see this kind of deal being affected by the current environment, given, for example, that yesterday's announcement by the Russian government that the special deal for refugees from the Donbass in Russia will be canceled, and that effectively 1 million people who are now in Russia will be forced back into Ukraine and not into the Donbass, obviously. Okay. And the question is, how will Russian policy towards potentially discouraging that large investment in Ukraine play out, in your opinion, in the coming months? Thank you.
Okay, I don't know. I have read stories on that land deal in Ukraine. It concerns food security, right? That's sort of one Chinese strategic priority, is ensure that all people have access to food, right? They have tremendous problems with farming and other issues. So they're always looking for access not only to resources, but to food outside. So food security is underlying primary concern for the Chinese going forward. At the same time, when you mention the PLA companies doing investments, it's not really, again, it's PLA's commercial interests. The military has commercial interests as well, right? So they do businesses. There's no separation between civil, military, right, programs. There are no civil sort of military clear lines, right? So I would see it sort of part of the PLA again into the commercialization, into promoting their interest. It's a very specific question. I'm not an expert on economics of these particular issues, so I will not be able to give you sort of detailed, comprehensive answer. But I really would focus on the need of China to ensure food security for its own people down the road. In relation to climate change, to environmental issues that they face, right? The environmental catastrophe that China faces internally, right, forces them to seek, access to food resources outside as well, right? But again, goes back to my initial argument that China's primary security interest is internal, right? Making sure the Chinese Communist Party will continue for the next 100 years or so, and that they will develop the country by 2049 into comprehensive national sort of power or regeneration that they always emphasize. And in order to do that, they need to have balanced socio-economic development. President Xi has a lot of he consolidated power. He's sort of moving into more authoritative direction in a way, and is consolidating. The anti-corruption drive is that he's going to have right now is sort of trying to root out sort of any sort of opposition out there. But taking that aside, really food security, environmental security, energy security, high-tech issues are all engines of growth for future China, and China needs that. But at the same time, again, China's trying to influence and it promotes its interests, abroad as well. The problem is the narrative is not entirely positive, and there are questions surrounding the future trajectories. So the key issue for China, as well as the world, is how do we manage China's rise? The Chinese themselves don't know that. They don't know what's the end of the line. Right? And the debate that we have is, as China rises, will its strategic intentions change later on? Right? Because they have greater capability, will their strategic intentions be different from now? And that is the key uncertainty out there. Right? So as you can do more with your military, with your economic power, will your interest, with your strategy change, and will it be different? And at the same time, how do we manage our own internal crises and making sure that the country stays, together?
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. One is here and one is there, and then we will have to conclude. Please.
Good evening. My name is Michal Vodrážka. I'll try to be make my question short. I would like to ask about strategy and use that China or CCP might have for Chinese communities living abroad. That's relevant for Southeast Asia, but I would like to hear your comments on the European situation, because some time ago I read an article about how some Italian cities have big issues with handling their Chinese communities, and it was mentioned that China on purpose sends people from specific provinces or regions to different countries, so it's more easy for them to build and maintain networks that can be then used by the Chinese government. So, I mean, we don't have a big Chinese minority here in the Czech Republic, but it might be different in other European countries. So if you could comment on that, thank you.
What is a key issue right now is a shift in Chinese policy and Chinese interest into protecting its own citizens abroad. Fundamentally, that will drive, again, the military, political, other actions out there. So traditionally, China had a principle of non-interference. We don't interfere into any other country's internal domestic affairs. Now, the shift is a little bit different. As more Chinese are working abroad, particularly in crisis-prone areas like in Africa or Middle East or somewhere else, the Chinese government is obliged or is forced to protect its own citizens abroad. Right? So what we'll see is in a PLA, when we look at the PLA, they're already trying to create some of the units that will have that extended reach and extract and protect Chinese citizens abroad. So, for example, when I'm sure there was in Libya or there were some other countries in the Middle East, the Chinese Navy came there and they evacuated its citizens abroad. Right? That is a key sort of priority that I see from my desk. Right? I don't see sort of underlying, strategic issue or policy that's sending Chinese citizens abroad to deliberately. They go on their own. It's not the Chinese governments. Maybe in some major, structural projects in the Middle East, or whether you have a government-to-government projects, or when they try to build a major railways, where they have a major yes, right? But I don't see deliberate resettlement of the Chinese to Europe or elsewhere, right? I may be wrong, though.
Okay, please.
Good evening. My name is Katarina Procházková. I'm from Czech TV. Firstly, I would like to thank you for a great lecture. And my question is about investments. You are only talking about the Chinese investments in Europe. So I would like to focus on Czech Republic. Chinese are right now investing into Czech Republic. They are highly welcomed by Czech government, especially one company called CEF, that is how we know connected to PLA and secret services. And I would like to know what is your opinion about these investments and if it's not risky for us to welcome these countries.
That's, again, I understand. That's a very complex and odd issue. The way I see it, again, economically, these investments don't make any sense. There's an underlying political interest behind them. If I can be blunt, China sees Czech Republic as the weakest link in the European Union. Right? It is a weakest link. It provides access to the whole Europe through Czech. So Czech is a sort of the investment in Czech Republic is meant, it's more broader European, has a broader strategic European significance, right? By investing in Czech Republic, again, it creates sort of a short-term benefit, right? It creates jobs, and there's a sort of very positive narrative about, sort of economic cooperation, right? But this is just the first phase, right? Chinese strategic interests go much deeper. So in the second wave of investments, China will try to invest into key strategic industries, energy, transportation. What you see happening in England now, in Britain, the British sign a deal, or they're trying to sign a deal with the Chinese, that the Chinese will basically control a stake of a nuclear power plant, right? In the long term, you have to ask questions on that, right? So getting the what will they want in return? Do they want money in return, or do they want something else? And again, in my view, they want to increase their political influence in Europe through Czech Republic. So the specific investments in Europe must be seen in a broader sort of, how they see, the access into Europe, and how they can, have not only market access, but also political influence down the road, right? Because it creates, as I mentioned in my presentation, it creates a zone, one of the zones of strategic dependencies. So this region becomes, strategically in the long run, not now, potentially more dependent, toward Chinese interests, right? It's a very, very subtle strategy, right? You see investments here, there, all across Europe. It's not only Czech Republic. If you put this together, you see underlying pattern, right? So the first wave is sort of the market entry access, and then I guarantee you there will be second or third wave of investment that will focus on key strategic industries. And here again, getting access to foreign technology, getting access to comms, financial markets, getting access and control and influence over these strategic industries will be a challenge, not only for Czech Republic, for the entire Europe. So it is very important to look at the long-term strategic consequences of these investments.
Well, it goes already into the energy sector here. The investment goes to JNT, and if you look at where JNT has invested in Czech Republic, is the energy sector. It's not the majority stakeholder, it's already not the majority stake, etc., but it's definitely in the direction of the energy sector, and maybe not only. Let me ask you one more question. You mentioned the cyber, etc., and the Chinese and the technologies. How much should I be worried, as a Czech citizen, that the whole network here runs on Huawei? Well, no, really, I'm not sure.
Again, that's a sort of it's a very complicated question. I wouldn't trust everything that I would say to the phone, because you might have parallel listening posts, from the NSA as well from the Chinese, But the key question is reliability and dependencies down the road, right? So a lot of these components are made in China, and it's very simple. in the production process to alter these components and to create backdoors and to enable system backdoors that will enable them access down the road. That is the principal challenge that the US has and other countries have with China controlling some of these technology, because it has been proven that Huawei, and other Chinese companies deliberately have sort of backdoors into some of these systems. And this is just a phone, right? Imagine if it's a nuclear plant, right? And they understand the technology, they understand its vulnerabilities, the potential for, not only, it's not, I would say, direct action, but it's just sort of indirect action where the Chinese are able to only access the information but also transfer the knowledge and pursue their interests through that is also important. So my final point is really, China is rising. It's not out there to seek war. It's not out there to, compete with everybody, but it is a sort of a challenge. And how do we manage China's rise? It's not only a question of Asia, but it's also must be reflected in Europe as well. So I thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.